I used to think people vanished for selfish reasons, that they folded under the weight of their own lives, took the money or the silence, and ran from consequences. Then I got Daniel's letter. It arrived in an envelope with no return address, postmarked somewhere up the coast. My name, typed, not written, was centered on the front like it belonged to someone else. The paper was thick, almost too formal for something so intimate. Inside, no explanation. Just a single sheet, a few clean paragraphs, and his signature at the bottom. I read it 3 times before I even sat down. Leah, if you're reading this, I've gone. Not for the reasons you're imagining. Not because of the money. I needed to leave before the story swallowed me whole. It wasn't the note of a man escaping his life. It was a breadcrumb. A quiet confession. The tone was calm, almost clinical, so perfectly Daniel. Not a hint of euphoria, despite the windfall. Just his usual careful, deliberate cadence, the kind of voice you had to lean into to really hear. There are things you already suspect, things you were smart enough not to say out loud. You're probably wondering why I didn't come to you sooner. The truth is, I didn't trust the timing or myself. I waited too long. But it's not too late for you. At first, I thought it was about the lottery. About guilt, maybe. Survivor's remorse. But something about the letter kept echoing. Not the words themselves, but the spaces between them. I recognized the cadence. It was like the old reports he used to write. The language was restrained, measured, even coded. Daniel never left things messy. If he'd written this to me, it was for a reason. I made tea, sat on the floor, laid out the letter again, this time next to a stack of old land use permits I hadn't touched in months. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but something told me to start where he ended. That's when the pattern started to form. The hardest part about chasing ghosts is knowing where to begin. Especially when the ghost was someone who never left anything to chance. Daniel's letter wasn't a confession, it was a nudge. Subtle, specific, careful. He wasn't just saying goodbye, he was handing off a task he couldn't complete himself. I didn't fully understand what that task was yet, but I knew enough to start with the documents he hinted at. Back when we worked in adjacent departments, Daniel used to joke that bureaucracy wasn't built to hide the truth, it was built to exhaust the people looking for it. And he was right. The environmental permitting system is a fortress of acronyms and unread appendices, where the devil doesn't hide in the details, he files them. If Daniel wanted me to find something, it was buried in the files no one else had the patience to read. So I pulled up the internal server archives and searched for his last 5 permit reviews. Nothing immediately suspicious until I noticed the approval dates. 4 out of 5 had been finalized on Fridays. That might seem harmless, but in our world, Friday approvals are a red flag. It's the oldest trick in the book. Bury a permit in a weekend, let the objection period slide by unnoticed, and by Monday, it's too late to stop. One project in particular caught my eye. Murchison Holdings Coastal Parcel 7B, Preliminary Wetlands Impact Report. I remembered that name, Murchison. Flashy developer, all sharp suits and smoother press releases. He'd made waves 2 years back when he tried to build luxury condos on what turned out to be protected nesting habitat. Daniel had flagged that project back then, and it had gone dormant under public pressure. But now it was back, renamed, reworded, repackaged. And this time, it had Daniel's signature on the approval line. That didn't make sense. Daniel wouldn't have signed off on anything from Murchison, not without a fight. Either he'd changed, or someone had changed the paperwork. I cross-referenced the parcel data with archived communications. Sure enough, there were internal memos, emails between permitting staff, CC'd to legal counsel, asking for an expedited review due to political interest in economic development. That phrase alone made my stomach turn. It was code for, someone powerful wants this done, so don't ask questions. The next morning, I took a quiet walk around the building before clocking in. It was early, the kind of gray that sits heavy over Sacramento before the sun burns it off. I passed Daniel's old office. They'd already reassigned it to a junior analyst who had tacked up a dry erase calendar and a coffee-stained poster about wetlands biodiversity. I lingered a second longer than I should have. Back at my desk, I opened one of Daniel's personal folders from the shared drive. Nothing fancy, just a label that read Ref. 7B Notes. Inside were 3 PDFs and a Word doc titled Preliminary Discrepancies. I opened it. My chest tightened. It wasn't a report. It was a list. Bullet points, each tied to a timestamp and permit number. One entry read, "Developer submitted third-party survey dated before public consultation period, likely fabricated." Another, "State Water Board comment mysteriously excluded from final EIR filing." This wasn't casual suspicion. This was groundwork. Quiet, thorough, procedural. It read like someone preparing for litigation or whistleblowing. Why hadn't he submitted it? The answer felt obvious. He didn't trust the channels. He'd seen how things disappeared, how files went missing or got overwritten when they became inconvenient. Maybe he thought I'd see it if I went looking. Maybe that was the whole point of the letter. That afternoon, I requested physical copies of the Parcel 7B file under my compliance review authority. Standard procedure, nothing flashy. The clerk didn't blink. She printed the documents and handed them over in a manila folder. I flipped through the first few pages. Something was off. Page 7's Soil Toxicity Index listed the contractor as Bayview Consulting, a firm I knew had gone bankrupt 2 years ago. And yet here they were, signing off on a clean report just last month. Either someone had resurrected them, or someone had copied their old template and hoped no one would check. That was the first breadcrumb Daniel left. And now I was following. It's funny how quickly a small inconsistency turns into something larger. Like a crack in a dam you barely notice until water starts bleeding through. That's what Parcel 7B became, a slow leak revealing the pressure underneath. By the end of the week, I had collected enough minor irregularities to know this wasn't bureaucratic laziness. It was orchestration. The report Daniel referenced, Bayview Consulting Soil Analysis, should have triggered an automatic review under state law. Instead, it slid through unchallenged. That didn't happen by accident. I started drawing connections in my notebook, something Daniel and I used to do during late audits. A bubble for the parcel. Arrows leading to names, firms, dates. The more I added, the more tangled it became. Murchison's name popped up again and again, always adjacent to firms with histories of environmental shortcuts or political ties. But the rail break came from a forgotten file buried deep in our internal GIS database, an old zoning overlay from before the parcel was reclassified. It showed the land had originally been designated as a sensitive coastal basin, a designation that would have made development nearly impossible without a lengthy public consultation and federal review. That designation was missing from every recent file. I pulled up the record of the zoning change. It had been reclassified 18 months ago in a quiet amendment added to a larger infrastructure bill. No debate. No notice to stakeholders. Just one line in a 300-page document. Exactly the kind of thing Daniel would have flagged if he'd been paying attention, unless someone made sure he wasn't. I found a calendar invite in his archived inbox for a mandatory departmental offsite retreat scheduled the same week the zoning change passed. A 3-day wellness and bonding seminar, off-grid, no laptops. I remember that retreat. It was boring and oddly timed. Daniel hated those things. Someone had planned this. The implications made my throat tighten. This wasn't just about missed paperwork or bureaucratic oversight. This was coordinated. A parcel stripped of its protections, pushed through with doctored reports, propped up by political favors. And Daniel had known. I kept circling back to that thought. He hadn't disappeared to avoid consequences. He vanished because he realized he couldn't stop this from within. But he hadn't destroyed the evidence, hadn't leaked it to the press or dumped it online. Instead, he'd left me a trail. A quiet, almost invisible request to pick up where he'd left off. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed replaying conversations we'd had months ago, moments that had seemed like throwaway observations. One came to mind, Daniel complaining about how nobody read public meeting transcripts anymore. All the good stuff is hidden in plain sight, he'd said. But you have to dig past the sound bites. So I did. I sent anonymous copies of the injunction and supporting evidence to 2 investigative journalists, one at a regional paper, one embedded in environmental reporting. Not the big national names. People who still read permit filings and knew how to trace ownership structures through 5 layers of shell companies. They called back within days. And this time, I didn't stay anonymous. I gave my name. I spoke slowly, clearly, carefully. I wasn't making accusations, I was presenting records. Dates. Signatures. An audit trail. Next, I contacted the EPA's Regional Compliance Office. Not the general hotline, the Enforcement Division. I packaged the Parcel 7B documents and Daniel's whistleblower file with a subject line quoting federal wetland protection statutes that had been bypassed. Within 48 hours, I had a meeting on the books. In that meeting, I watched as the senior investigator flipped through the file with the practiced eye of someone used to being lied to. But when he got to the dual reports from Bayview Consulting, the identical formatting, the metadata showing the second version had been created months later, he leaned back in his chair and said, "That's a felony." That word hit harder than I expected. Felony. All this time, I'd been framing it in my head as misconduct. Corruption, yes, but the soft kind. The kind that hides behind policy ambiguity. But no, this was criminal. Daniel had known. He just didn't think anyone would care. But now they did. Within a week, the injunction made headlines. Small ones tucked under the fold. But they were there. Development project halted amid allegations of environmental fraud. Then another. Anonymous civil servants investigation spurs federal interest. I wasn't named yet, but it was only a matter of time. Karen called me into her office. Her tone was cordial. Too cordial. "You've made quite the splash," she said. "I followed the law," I replied. She nodded, tight-lipped. "Just remember, law doesn't always protect the people who invoke it." But I wasn't scared anymore. I'd played by the rules. I'd documented everything. I didn't shout, didn't smear anyone publicly. I'd simply used the structure that Daniel respected: rules, policy, language, to strike where it mattered. They couldn't say I'd gone rogue. Because I hadn't. I'd gone lawful. The first time I saw Murchison in court, he looked bored. His suit was perfect, of course. His lawyer even more so. They stood there in polished defiance, murmuring to each other as if the proceedings were just a formality. A hiccup. A misunderstanding that a few well-placed phone calls could smooth over. But the judge didn't see it that way. By the time the hearing opened, the EPA had launched a formal investigation. My files had triggered a federal audit, which turned up 3 more permits with forged impact data, all connected to Seekline Ventures. Public interest groups had filed amicus briefs. Journalists were digging deeper, connecting the dots between campaign donors and zoning approvals. The courtroom wasn't full, but it felt dense. Tense. Even Murchison's side seemed to realize they were no longer in control of the narrative. I didn't testify that day. My statement was part of the record, sealed and submitted in advance. But I sat in the back, my notes in hand, watching a process I had spent my entire career quietly believing in, even when it failed me. Today, it wasn't failing. Murchison's team tried their usual arguments: confusion, technical errors, miscommunication between contractors. But the documents spoke for themselves. Too many errors lined up too neatly. Too many missing reviews, vanished surveyors, duplicated maps. It was death by paper. The injunction held. Then came the orders. Further developments suspended indefinitely. A grand jury impaneled. 2 senior permitting officials placed on leave pending disciplinary review. Quiet emails began circulating in the department. Language like oversight restructuring and temporary transparency compliance officer appeared. I was offered the role. I declined. I hadn't done this to climb anything. What surprised me most was how quickly the system shifted once the pressure became external. The same colleagues who'd once avoided eye contact in the hallway now nodded respectfully, even offered praise in hushed tones. Karen never apologized, but her silence held a different weight now. She knew. Daniel's name, still absent from the public story, remained my own quiet secret. I didn't push to correct it. Not yet. He hadn't wanted recognition. He wanted results. And he got them. Sometimes, justice doesn't come in a dramatic moment. It arrives in documents quietly entered into evidence. In hearings that go untelevised. In signatures that can't be faked. This wasn't a cinematic victory. But it was a real one. That mattered more. It arrived 3 weeks after the hearing. No return address. No signature. Just a cream-colored postcard tucked in among utility bills and circulars. The photo on the front was of a rugged coastline, jagged cliffs, wind-bent cypress, water the color of slate under a silver sky. It looked familiar, though I couldn't place it. Pacific Northwest, maybe. Or somewhere along the Irish coast. Wild. Remote. Unclaimed. I turned it over and read the handwriting. It was unmistakably Daniel's. Precise. Even. No slant to the letters, no flourish, just clarity. Leah, I heard you followed the threads. Thank you for giving it weight. I couldn't have asked for a better witness. Some things don't want to be salvaged. Some just need to be seen before they vanish. You saw them. D. That was all. No location. No promise to return. No talk of the lottery, the trial, or the outcome. Just those few lines, half closure, half benediction. A farewell from someone who had already made peace with absence. I stood there at my kitchen counter, holding the card like it was glass. A part of me wanted to be angry at him for disappearing, for leaving me to pick up the pieces, for trusting me without asking first. But that feeling faded as fast as it came. Because I understood now. The postcard wasn't about escape. It was about trust. Daniel had always known he wouldn't finish the fight. He didn't expect to win it himself. He expected to begin it thoroughly enough that someone else could, if they were willing to do the slow work. And I had. The postcard went into the fireproof box with the rest of his documents. I didn't scan it. Didn't post it online. I just let it sit there, between the whistleblower complaint and a printout of the court order suspending the project. A final piece of evidence, not for the case, but for the story. I walked out onto my balcony that evening, tea in hand, watching the sun sink past the rooftops. The city carried on oblivious. The news cycle had moved on. But the land Daniel saved still sat untouched, wild and waiting. No bulldozers. No ribbon cuttings. Just the sound of wind moving through what was almost lost. Somewhere out there, he was watching it too, I liked to think. Maybe not from that exact coastline, but from somewhere with salt in the air and space enough to breathe. He didn't need applause. He needed peace. And I had helped give it to him.